What if I told you that the world's most famous trade route was actually a death trap disguised as opportunity? What secrets lie buried in the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert? How did ordinary men survive months of unimaginable hardship just to transport silken spices across impossible distances? And what was life really like for the forgotten heroes who connected east and west, one grueling step at a time? Welcome back to another journey through boring history for sleep. Before we begin our expedition across the Silk Road tonight, I'm curious, where in the world are you checking in from? What time is it there right now? Are you settling in for the evening? Or perhaps it's the middle of the night where you are. Take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe turn those lights down low. Perhaps switch on a fan for some gentle background noise. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you unwind and learn something fascinating before sleep, I'd appreciate a like on this video. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to join our growing community of history lovers who find peace in the past. Your support means everything to this channel. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or simply check in and let me know how you're doing tonight. You're an important part of our community, and I'm grateful for each of you who joins me on these historical journeys. Now, let's step back in time, about 1,000 years, and experience what it was truly like to be one of the most essential yet forgotten figures of medieval commerce. A Silk Road camel driver. Tonight, we'll walk in the footsteps of Marco Polo, unravel ancient mysteries, and peek inside the bustling caravanserais, where cultures collided in the most fascinating ways. But first, let's experience the brutal reality of life as a camel driver on history's most dangerous highway. The sun hasn't yet risen over the Taklamakan Desert, but you're already awake. Your body jolted from restless sleep by the familiar sound of camels groaning and shifting in the pre-dawn darkness. Your name is Ahmad, and you've been a camel driver for 12 years now. Long enough to know that each journey across this merciless expanse of sand and stone might be your last. You're 34 years old, though the desert has aged you far beyond your years. Your face is leather brown and deeply lined from squinting against sandstorms and the relentless sun. Your hands are gnarled and scarred from handling rope and camel gear day after day. Most of your teeth are gone, ground down by the sand that gets into everything, absolutely everything you eat and drink. As you struggle to your feet, every joint in your body protests. Your back aches constantly from sleeping on the hard ground night after night, using nothing but a thin blanket and perhaps a saddle for a pillow. Your legs are bowed slightly from years of walking alongside these massive, stubborn beasts. The bottoms of your feet are thick with calluses, but even so, you can feel every sharp stone and burning grain of sand through your worn leather boots. The caravan you're traveling with consists of 43 camels, each carrying roughly 400 pounds of precious cargo. There's silk from China, of course. Rolls and rolls of the lustrous fabric that gives this trade route its name. But there's also porcelain, tea, spices, like cinnamon and cardamom, jade jewelry, and even some exotic medicines made from ground pearls and rhinoceros horn. The total value of what you're transporting could feed a small village for several years. It's worth more than you could earn in 10 lifetimes. And that terrifying responsibility weighs on you more heavily than any physical burden. You're part of a crew of 8 drivers, led by a caravan master named Hassan, who's made this journey 17 times and lived to tell about it. Each driver is responsible for 5 or 6 camels, and you've learned that these animals have personalities, more complex and stubborn than most humans you've known. There's Kadir, the lead camel of your string, a massive male who stands nearly 7 feet tall and has a particularly vindictive habit of spitting when he's annoyed, which is often. Then there's Zara, a female who's actually quite gentle, but has the unfortunate tendency to wander off if you don't watch her constantly. Your relationship with these animals is complicated. You depend on them completely for your survival, yet they seem determined to make your life as difficult as possible. Camels are notorious for their stubbornness and their ability to hold grudges. If you treat one poorly, even accidentally, it will remember and find ways to make you pay for weeks afterward. As the first pale light appears on the horizon, you begin the daily ritual of preparing for another day's journey. First, you check each camel for injuries or illness, running your hands along their legs and examining their feet for cuts or embedded stones. The health of these animals isn't just important for the success of the caravan, it's a matter of life and death for everyone involved. A lame camel in the middle of the desert is often a death sentence, not just for the animal, but potentially for the entire group. Next comes the loading process, a delicate dance you've performed thousands of times but can never take for granted. Each bale of silk, each chest of porcelain, must be positioned perfectly to distribute the weight evenly across the camel's back. Get it wrong, and the animal will be in pain, move slowly, and potentially injure itself. Get it really wrong, and valuable cargo will shift, fall, or be damaged beyond repair. The paxadels themselves are marvels of engineering, carefully designed to spread weight across the camel's broad back without creating pressure points that could cause sores or injury. But even the best equipment requires constant adjustment and maintenance. You're always tightening straps, repositioning loads, and checking for wear and tear that could lead to disaster. By the time the sun is fully above the horizon, the temperature is already climbing toward what will become an unbearable furnace by midday. You've learned to dress in layers, loose-fitting robes that you can adjust as the day progresses. In the morning, you might need the extra warmth, but by noon, you'll be stripping down to the absolute minimum to avoid heat exhaustion. The desert plays cruel tricks with temperature. During the day, the sand becomes so hot it can burn through the soles of your boots. You've seen men try to walk barefoot on it and end up with second-degree burns on their feet. But at night, especially in winter, the temperature can drop below freezing. You'll go from desperately seeking shade and coolness to huddling around a small fire, teeth chattering, wondering if you'll make it till morning. Water is everything out here, more precious than any silk or spice you're carrying. Each person in the caravan is allocated roughly 3 gallons per day, but that has to cover drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. You've learned to ration it carefully, taking small sips throughout the day rather than drinking large amounts at once. Your body has adapted over the years, your kidneys becoming incredibly efficient at conserving every drop. But water isn't just about personal survival. The camels need even more than you do, roughly 10 to 15 gallons each per day when it's available. Finding reliable water sources along the route is a constant worry that keeps Hassan awake at night. Poring over maps and consulting with other caravan masters about the current conditions of various oases and wells. You've experienced the crushing disappointment of arriving at an oasis that's supposed to be a reliable water source, only to find it dried up or contaminated. It's a despair that goes beyond words. Watching your water supplies dwindle while the camels become increasingly distressed, and the desert stretches endlessly in all directions. The Taklamakan Desert is particularly notorious for its sandstorms, and you've learned to read the signs with the expertise of a meteorologist. There's a particular quality to the light, a strange stillness in the air, a behavior change in the animals that tells you a storm is coming hours before the first winds arrive. When you spot these signs, the entire caravan shifts into emergency mode. During a sandstorm, visibility drops to 0. The wind howls with such force it can knock a man off his feet. And the sand flies so thick it's like being inside a grinding wheel. You wrap cloths around your face, trying to filter the air you breathe. But sand still finds its way into your mouth, nose, and lungs. It gets between your teeth, under your eyelids, and into your ears. 4 days after a storm, you'll be coughing up sand and feeling like you're chewing on grit with every meal. The camels hate these storms as much as you do, and they'll often kneel down and refuse to move until the weather passes. During particularly severe storms, you'll huddle together with the animals, using their large bodies as windbreaks, while everyone waits for nature's fury to subside. But storms aren't the only danger you face. Bandits are a constant threat along the Silk Road, and they know exactly where the most vulnerable stretchers are. These aren't romanticized thieves from adventure stories. They're desperate. Violent men who will kill without hesitation for even a fraction of what your caravan is carrying. You've learned to sleep with one eye open, your hand always near the curved knife you carry at your belt. Even during the day, you're constantly scanning the horizon for signs of riders or movement that doesn't belong. The rocky outcrops and small hills that dot the desert landscape provide perfect hiding places for ambushes, and you've seen the remains of caravans that weren't careful enough or lucky enough to spot trouble before it found them. Hassan has arranged for armed guards to travel with your caravan, but there are only 4 of them, and they're outnumbered by potential threats. Your best defense is often speed and stealth, traveling at times and along routes that bandits don't expect, making camp in defensible positions, and always staying alert. The loneliness of the desert is something outsiders can't truly understand. Yes, you're traveling with other people, but the vastness of the landscape makes you feel incredibly small and isolated. Days can pass with nothing but sand dunes and rocky outcrops in every direction. No sign of human life or civilization. The silence is profound and sometimes oppressive, broken only by the sound of camel bells, the creak of leather gear, and the whisper of wind across sand. At night, when the caravan makes camp, there's often little energy for conversation. Everyone is exhausted, focused on the basic tasks of survival, preparing food, caring for the animals, setting up whatever meager shelter they can manage. You fall asleep looking up at stars that seem impossibly bright and numerous in the clear desert air. But even their beauty can't overcome the bone-deep weariness that comes from another day of simply surviving. The food you eat is monotonous and often barely adequate. Dried meat, unleavened bread, dates, and whatever vegetables can be preserved for the journey. Everything tastes of sand, and fresh food is a luxury you experience only at the larger oases, where local people might have gardens or livestock. You've learned to appreciate the smallest luxuries, a piece of fresh fruit, a cup of tea that hasn't been contaminated with sand, a meal that doesn't crunch between your teeth. Your feet are in constant agony. Despite the thick calluses, the heat, sharp stones, and endless walking take a terrible toll. Blisters form and burst and form again, sometimes becoming infected in the dirty conditions. You've seen strong men reduced to tears by foot injuries that make every step torture, but stopping isn't really an option. The caravan must keep moving, and those who can't keep up are often left behind. The camels, despite their reputation for being perfectly adapted to desert life, suffer as much as you do. Their feet can become injured on sharp rocks. They can become dehydrated or ill from bad water, and they're susceptible to a variety of diseases and parasites. When a camel becomes seriously injured or sick, it's usually a death sentence. And you've had to help put down animals you've worked with and depended on for months or even years. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of your job is the crushing weight of responsibility and the constant awareness that everything can go wrong in an instant. You're responsible not just for your own survival, but for the care of animals worth a fortune, for cargo that represents the livelihoods of merchants and traders across 2 continents, and for your part in keeping the entire caravan moving safely across one of the most dangerous landscapes on Earth. Every decision you make, from how fast to push the animals to which path to take around an obstacle, could have life or death consequences. The stress is constant and exhausting, layered on top of the physical hardships that would be challenging enough on their own. Yet somehow, despite all of this suffering and danger, you continue. Perhaps it's the knowledge that this trade route connects civilizations, that the silk and spices you're carrying will bring joy and wonder to people thousands of miles away. Perhaps it's pride in being part of something larger than yourself, a tradition that stretches back centuries. Or perhaps it's simply the understanding that this is the life you know, harsh as it may be, and there's a strange satisfaction in mastering such a difficult and dangerous profession. As the caravan prepares to move out for another day's journey across the endless sand, you take one last look at the horizon ahead, knowing that somewhere out there, weeks or months of hardship await, but also knowing that if you're fortunate and careful and strong enough, you'll eventually reach your destination, deliver your precious cargo, and live to make the journey again. The caravan finally begins to move, a slow procession of swaying camels and dust-covered men that will cover perhaps 15 to 20 miles today if conditions are favorable. The pace is deliberate, almost maddeningly slow to someone who doesn't understand the realities of desert travel. Push the animals too hard, and they'll collapse from exhaustion or dehydration. Move too slowly, and you risk running out of water before reaching the next oasis. Hassan, the caravan master, rides at the front on a magnificent white camel that's earned its position through years of reliable service. He's constantly scanning the horizon, reading the landscape with an expertise born from 17 crossings of this merciless desert. Every rock formation, every subtle change in the sand's color, every shift in wind direction provides information that could mean the difference between life and death. You've learned to read some of these signs yourself over your 12 years of service. The way certain birds circle can indicate water within a day's journey. The presence of specific plants, even dried and dead-looking ones, suggests underground moisture that might sustain the caravan if things become desperate. The angle of erosion on rock faces tells you about prevailing winds and can help orient you when sandstorms obliterate all other landmarks. But you've also learned that the desert is full of deceptive signs and false promises. Mirages are a constant torment, shimmering visions of lakes and cities that dissolve into nothingness as you approach. You've seen strong men weep with frustration after chasing these illusions, wasting precious energy and water pursuing something that never existed. Now you know to ignore what your eyes tell you and trust only the proven landmarks and the wisdom of experienced travelers. The social dynamics within the caravan are complex and constantly shifting. There's a hierarchy among the drivers based on experience, skill, and the number of successful crossings they've completed. You're somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, respected for your experience, but not yet considered one of the true veterans. The newest drivers, young men on their first or second crossing, look to you for guidance and try to learn from watching how you handle difficult situations. But there's also competition and occasional conflict. The success of the caravan depends on everyone working together, but individual drivers are also competing for future employment opportunities. Caravan masters remember who performed well under pressure, who kept their animals healthy, and who could be trusted with the most valuable cargo. Your reputation is being built or destroyed with every decision you make, every problem you solve or fail to solve. The relationship between drivers and the armed guards who protect the caravan is particularly interesting. The guards, mostly Mongols and Turks, with reputations as fierce warriors, initially seem to look down on the drivers as mere laborers, but experienced guards quickly learn that drivers possess knowledge and skills that can be just as important as fighting ability. You know the desert, understand the animals, and can often spot danger before it becomes obvious to warriors accustomed to different kinds of terrain. Over the course of a long journey, mutual respect usually develops. You've shared meals with guards around evening campfires, listening to their stories of battles and raids, while sharing your own tales of desert survival and miraculous escapes from natural disasters. These relationships sometimes continue beyond individual journeys, creating networks of professional connections that span the trade routes. The merchants who own the cargo you're transporting are a different matter entirely. Most of them travel with the caravan, unwilling to let their fortunes out of their sight. They're a mixed group, ranging from wealthy traders making their 10th or 20th crossing to ambitious young men risking everything on a single speculative venture. Some are kind and understanding, recognizing that their success depends on the skill and dedication of men like you. Others are demanding and suspicious, convinced that every driver is looking for an opportunity to steal from them. You've learned to navigate these relationships carefully. Be too friendly with merchants, and other drivers might suspect you of seeking special treatment or favoritism. Be too distant, and merchants might decide you're untrustworthy or incompetent. The balance is delicate, and mistakes can cost you future employment, or create conflicts that make an already difficult journey even more challenging. The midday heat is now approaching its peak, and the caravan's pace slows even further. This is the most dangerous time of day, when heat exhaustion and dehydration can strike quickly and without warning. You're constantly watching both your animals and your fellow humans for signs of distress. Camels that start to stagger or show reluctance to continue need immediate attention. Men who stop sweating despite the heat are in serious danger, their bodies' cooling systems failing in ways that can quickly become fatal. Hassan calls for a brief rest in the shade of a rock outcropping, one of the few pieces of natural shelter visible in this barren landscape. The camels are allowed to kneel, and everyone huddles in whatever shadow they can find. No one speaks much during these rest stops. Everyone is conserving energy, trying to stay as still as possible to minimize water loss through sweat and exertion. You take the opportunity to check your feet, which have been throbbing painfully for the last few hours. Removing your boots reveals exactly what you expected. Fresh blisters have formed on top of old ones, and there's a concerning amount of swelling around your ankles. You apply some of the precious animal fat you carry for just this purpose, trying to reduce friction and prevent infection. The relief is minimal and temporary, but it's better than nothing. Looking around at your fellow drivers, you see similar scenes of maintenance and minor medical care. One man is wrapping his hands, which have been torn up by rope burns from managing a particularly stubborn camel. Another is treating a nasty scrape on his arm, where he was pressed against a rock wall while guiding his animals through a narrow passage. These minor injuries are constant companions on the Silk Road, and learning to manage them without access to proper medical care is part of the job. The water ration comes around, measured out with painful precision by one of Hassan's assistants. You receive your midday portion, roughly a cup and a half of water that has to last you until the evening distribution. The water is warm, tastes of the leather bag it's been stored in, and contains a faint grittiness from sand that infiltrates everything. But it's life itself, and you drink it slowly, trying to make each swallow count. Food during these midday stops is minimal, just enough to keep your strength up without requiring significant water for digestion. You chew on dried dates and a small piece of hard bread, taking your time with each bite. The dates are a luxury, a sign that this particular caravan is relatively well provisioned. On some journeys, you've subsisted on nothing but grain porridge and whatever edible plants could be found along the route. As you rest, your mind wanders to your family back in Samarkand, a wife you haven't seen in 4 months, and 3 children who are growing up largely without a father. The money you earn from these journeys allows them to live comfortably by the standards of your community. But you wonder sometimes if the cost is worth it. Your oldest son is now 12, the same age you were when you started accompanying your father on caravan journeys. Will he follow the same path? Part of you hopes he'll find a safer, easier way to make a living. Another part recognizes that the skills and knowledge you could pass on represent a valuable inheritance in a world where most people have few options for earning a decent living. The brief rest ends too soon, as it always does. Hassan signals that it's time to move again, and the entire caravan groans back into motion. The afternoon stretch will be long and brutal, with the sun still high and hot for several more hours. But this is also when you might make the best progress, covering ground while you still have some energy and the animals are warmed up and moving well. As the caravan strings out across the desert once more, you fall into the rhythm that has sustained you through 12 years of this work. One foot in front of the other, eyes constantly scanning for danger or opportunity. Hands automatically adjusting loads and managing the camels with the kind of unconscious competence that comes only from years of practice. Your body aches, your throat is dry, and you know that tonight you'll collapse into exhausted sleep the moment you have the opportunity. But you also know that you're good at this impossible job. You're one of the men who makes transcontinental trade possible, who keeps the goods flowing between East and West, who maintains the economic connections that support millions of people across 2 continents. It's not glamorous, and few people will ever know your name or appreciate your contribution. But the silk on a Chinese empress's back, the spices in a Persian prince's kitchen, and the exotic medicines that save lives in distant cities all reached their destinations because men like you were willing to endure this daily suffering. The sun is climbing higher now, and already you can feel the heat beginning to build. It's going to be another brutal day in paradise. Marco Polo's lesser-known journey, the return from China. The year is 1292, and Marco Polo stands on the docks of Chuanzhou, watching Chinese laborers load the final supplies onto what will become his floating prison for the next 2 years. At 38 years old, he's spent more than half his life in the court of Kublai Khan, serving as diplomat, administrator, and trusted advisor to the most powerful ruler on earth. But now, homesick and aging, he faces a journey that will test every skill he's learned and push him closer to death than any adventure in his famous travels. What most people don't realize about Marco Polo's story is that his journey to China, the one everyone knows about, was actually the easy part. The real test, the true adventure that nearly killed him and his companions multiple times, was the return journey. And it began not with exploration and wonder, but with a diplomatic crisis that would determine whether he lived to see Venice again. Kublai Khan had a problem. His grandnephew Arghun ruled the Ilkhanate of Persia, a vast territory stretching from modern-day Iran to Turkey. Arghun's wife had recently died, and according to her dying wish, he could only remarry a woman from her own Mongol tribe. The Khan had selected the perfect bride, a 17-year-old princess named Kachin, beautiful, intelligent, and from the appropriate bloodline. But getting her safely from China to Persia, across thousands of miles of dangerous territory, required someone with extraordinary diplomatic skills and knowledge of both cultures. Marco Polo had spent years proving himself as a cultural bridge between East and West. He spoke Mongolian, Persian, and several Chinese dialects fluently. He understood the complex protocol of Mongol courts and had successfully negotiated treaties and trade agreements across the empire. Most importantly, Kublai Khan trusted him implicitly. When the overland route to Persia became too dangerous due to tribal warfare, the Khan made a decision that would change the course of Marco Polo's life forever. The sea route to Persia was largely unknown to the Mongols, but Marco Polo had observed Chinese naval technology and understood the monsoon patterns of the Indian Ocean. The Khan appointed him as chief escort and diplomatic guardian for Princess Kichen's bridal journey, a responsibility that came with enormous honor and equally enormous risk. Failure would mean not just his own death, but a diplomatic catastrophe that could destabilize the entire western portion of the Mongol Empire. The fleet that departed Chuanzhou consisted of 14 large junks, Chinese vessels that were marvels of engineering for their time. Each ship was over 200 feet long, with multiple masts and compartmented hulls that could survive damage that would sink European vessels. The largest ship carried the princess and her extensive entourage, while the others transported guards, supplies, gifts for the Persian court, and Marco Polo's own family. His father, Niccolo, and Uncle Mafu, both now elderly men who had been away from Venice for nearly a quarter century. But also aboard were 600 sailors, soldiers, servants, and officials. A floating city that needed to be fed, managed, and kept healthy during what everyone hoped would be a journey of no more than 18 months. Marco Polo found himself responsible not just for the princess's safety, but for the complex logistics of keeping this massive expedition functional across vast distances in unfamiliar waters. The first stage of the journey took them south along the Chinese coast and then through the treacherous waters around what is now Vietnam and Malaysia. These were seas controlled by pirates who had been preying on merchant vessels for generations, and they had no respect for diplomatic immunity or Mongol authority. The Chinese admiral commanding the fleet, a weathered veteran named Zhou, had warned Marco Polo that they would likely face attacks, and those attacks came sooner than expected. Just 5 days out from port, as they rounded the southern tip of Hainan Island, a fleet of pirate junks appeared on the horizon. These weren't the romanticized pirates of later literature. They were desperate, violent men who killed for a living and knew that a diplomatic fleet would be carrying treasures beyond imagination. The battle that followed was Marco Polo's first real taste of naval warfare, and it nearly ended the expedition before it truly began. Chinese naval tactics involved ramming, boarding, and the use of early firearms, primitive cannons that could punch holes in wooden hulls and scattered deadly fragments among enemy crews. Marco Polo watched in fascination and horror as the Chinese sailors fought with a professionalism and brutality that impressed even the Mongol guards. But the pirates were numerous and desperate, and the battle raged for most of the day. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of the escort vessels had been seriously damaged, and nearly 40 men were dead or wounded. Among the casualties was one of Princess Kichen's personal servants, a young woman who had been struck by a stray arrow while trying to help care for the wounded. Marco Polo found himself holding the dying girl's hand while she whispered final messages for her family back in China. His first real understanding of the human cost of the responsibility he had accepted. The princess herself had shown remarkable composure during the battle, helping to tend the wounded and keeping her other servants calm despite the chaos and violence surrounding them. Marco Polo was impressed by her courage. But he also realized that her safety had become exponentially more complicated than he had anticipated. This was no pleasure cruise. It was a military expedition through hostile territory. As they continued south through the South China Sea, the monsoon season began in earnest. The storms were unlike anything Marco Polo had experienced during his overland travels. Walls of water, 40 feet high, would crash over the ships, sending everything not tied down flying through the air. The vessels would climb up massive waves, hang suspended for terrifying moments at the crest, then plunge down the other side with a violence that left passengers and crew alike battered and seasick. During one particularly severe storm, the ship carrying most of their freshwater supplies was damaged, its hull cracked by the constant pounding of the waves. The crew managed to make temporary repairs, but it meant strict rationing for the remainder of the journey to their next port. Marco Polo found himself making decisions about water allocation that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. And he began to understand why sea captains aged so quickly and developed such hard expressions. The heat and humidity of the tropical waters created new challenges. Food spoiled rapidly despite their best preservation efforts, and several outbreaks of dysentery swept through the fleet. Marco Polo watched men waste away from diseases that had no cure, their bodies betraying them in the cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard the ships. He learned to recognize the early signs of various illnesses and became skilled at organizing quarantine procedures. But there was only so much that could be done with the medical knowledge and supplies available. Princess Kachin fell ill during the passage through what is now the Malacca Strait, developing a fever that left her delirious for several days. Marco Polo found himself sitting by her bedside, applying cool cloths to her forehead and trying to get her to drink small amounts of water and medicine. He realized that if she died under his care, it wouldn't matter what had caused her illness. He would be held responsible by both Kublai Khan and the Persian court. The diplomatic consequences could trigger wars that would kill thousands. Fortunately, the princess recovered, but the experience taught Marco Polo about the psychological pressure of his position. Every decision he made affected not just the immediate expedition, but potentially the stability of a large portion of the known world. The weight of that responsibility followed him day and night, making sleep difficult and filling his dreams with nightmares about diplomatic failures and military disasters. When they finally reached the port of Palembang in Sumatra, Marco Polo thought their troubles were over. The local sultan was nominally a vassal of Kublai Khan and had promised safe harbor and supplies for the expedition. But political situations in Southeast Asia were fluid and dangerous, and the sultan's loyalty proved to be far less reliable than they had hoped. Within days of their arrival, it became clear that the sultan was considering whether he could profit more from providing the promised assistance or from selling information about the expedition to their enemies. Pirates and rival rulers throughout the region had learned of the diplomatic fleet's route and were positioning themselves to attack. The promised safe harbor had become a trap. Marco Polo found himself negotiating for their lives in a series of tense meetings with the Sultan and his advisors. The discussions were conducted through multiple interpreters and involved complex promises of future trade benefits, threats of Mongol retaliation, and careful assessment of the military balance in the region. These were not the glamorous diplomatic encounters of later romance stories. They were brutal calculations of power and profit that could turn violent at any moment. The solution, when it came, required sacrificing a significant portion of their treasure as payment for safe passage and additional guards. Marco Polo had to make the decision to give away gifts intended for the Persian court, valuable silk and jade that represented months of careful diplomatic preparation, But the alternative was likely death for everyone aboard the fleet, and he chose survival over protocol. They departed Palembang after 3 weeks, poorer in goods, but richer in local knowledge about pirate movements and safe harbors along the next leg of their journey. The Sultan had provided them with local pilots who knew the treacherous waters around Java and the approach to Ceylon. But Marco Polo remained suspicious of everyone outside their immediate expedition. Trusts had become a luxury they couldn't afford. The crossing of the Indian Ocean presented new dangers. The monsoon winds that could speed their journey could also drive them far off course or tear their sails to shreds. The Chinese vessels, impressive as they were, had been designed primarily for coastal sailing, and the open ocean tested their limits. The constant flexing and twisting of the hulls in heavy seas caused leaks that required round-the-clock pumping, and the crews were exhausted from the relentless physical demands of keeping the ships afloat. But it was during this ocean crossing that Marco Polo experienced some of the most remarkable sights of his entire journey. Pods of whales that seemed to stretch to the horizon, their massive forms creating waves that rocked even the largest ships. Flying fish that glittered like silver arrows as they skipped across the water. Phosphorescent plankton that turned the ship's wake into streams of liquid fire in the darkness. These natural wonders provided brief moments of beauty and wonder that reminded him why travel could be so addictive despite its dangers and hardships. The princess, who had initially seemed fragile and sheltered, proved to be made of sterner stuff than anyone had expected. She adapted to shipboard life with grace and practicality, learning to sleep in a hammock, eat preserved foods, and even help with navigation by observing star positions. She and Marco Polo developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared adversity, and her insights into Mongol politics and Persian customs proved invaluable for planning the final diplomatic handover. But the ocean crossing also claimed more lives. An outbreak of scurvy weakened many of the crew members, their teeth loosening and their wounds refusing to heal. Several men died from infections that started with minor cuts and spread throughout their bodies. Marco Polo organized burial ceremonies at sea, watching good men wrapped in sailcloth disappear beneath the waves while he tried to maintain morale among the survivors. When they finally reached the port of Hormuz on the Persian Gulf, nearly 2 years after leaving China, Marco Polo calculated that they had lost almost a third of their original expedition to disease, accidents, and violence. The survivors were scarred, weathered, and profoundly changed by their experiences, but they had succeeded in their primary mission. Princess Kachin was alive, healthy, and ready to fulfill her diplomatic marriage that would strengthen the alliance between China and Persia. But even the successful completion of their diplomatic mission couldn't erase the toll the journey had taken on everyone involved. Marco Polo had aged visibly during the voyage, his hair now streaked with grey and his face marked by the constant stress of command decisions. He had learned lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the true cost of adventure that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The irony was that this harrowing, dangerous, diplomatically crucial journey would be largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by his earlier travels and his famous book. But for Marco Polo himself, it was the return journey that truly tested his character and proved his capabilities as more than just an observer of foreign customs, but as a leader capable of guiding others through impossible circumstances. As he stood on the dock at Hormuz, watching Princess Kachin prepare for the final stage of her journey to meet her new husband, Marco Polo knew that he had changed. The young man who had marveled at Chinese inventions and Mongol ceremonies was gone, replaced by someone who understood the real price of bridging cultures and the profound responsibility that came with serving as a link between civilizations. But there was an additional complication that Marco Polo hadn't fully anticipated when he accepted this mission. Princess Kachin, despite her youth and sheltered upbringing, had her own ideas about how the expedition should be conducted. She was, after all, a Mongol princess, raised in a culture that valued strength and independence even in women, and she had no intention of being treated as mere cargo to be delivered to a distant husband. The relationship between Marco Polo and the princess evolved gradually during the early stages of their journey. At first, their interactions were formal and constrained by the elaborate protocol that governed relations between Mongol royalty and foreign diplomats. But the shared dangers and hardships of sea travel had a way of breaking down social barriers that would have remained impenetrable in the protected environment of Kublai Khan's court. During the battle with pirates off Hainan Island, the princess had insisted on remaining on deck rather than hiding in her quarters as protocol would have dictated. Marco Polo had tried to convince her to seek safety below, but she had refused with a determination that reminded him uncomfortably of the Khan himself. She had watched the entire battle with a composure that impressed even the hardened Mongol guards, and afterward she had moved among the wounded with a practical efficiency that suggested she was far more capable than her delicate appearance might suggest. This incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Marco Polo began to consult with her on decisions that affected the expedition, initially out of courtesy, but increasingly because he recognized that her insights were often valuable. She understood Mongol political dynamics in ways that he, despite his years of service, could never fully grasp. She knew which officials could be trusted and which were likely to be more interested in personal advancement than in serving the Khan's interests. Her presence also provided a kind of diplomatic immunity, as local rulers and officials who might have been tempted to create difficulties for a Venetian merchant thought twice about offending a princess who could bring the Khan's wrath down upon them. But the princess also brought her own set of challenges. Her entourage included over 50 servants, guards, and attendants, each with their own needs, personalities, and agendas. Managing this group became one of Marco Polo's most time-consuming responsibilities. The servants were fiercely protective of the princess and deeply suspicious of everyone outside their immediate circle. They saw potential threats everywhere and were constantly bringing Marco Polo complaints or concerns that required his diplomatic attention. One particularly difficult situation arose when several of the princess's female servants became romantically involved with Chinese sailors. In Mongol culture, such relationships were not inherently scandalous, but they created potential complications for an expedition that needed to maintain strict discipline and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Marco Polo found himself mediating between the protective Mongol matrons who supervised the princess's household and the young women who saw no reason why a long sea voyage should prevent them from forming attachments to interesting young men. The resolution of this situation required all of Marco Polo's diplomatic skills. He couldn't simply forbid the relationships without risking resentment and potential rebellion among the servants. But he also couldn't allow a situation to develop that might reflect poorly on the princess or create divisions within the expedition. Eventually, he negotiated an arrangement where the relationships could continue under carefully supervised conditions, with clear understandings about what would happen when the expedition reached its destination. The incident taught Marco Polo an important lesson about leadership. Managing an expedition of this complexity wasn't just about navigation, logistics, and defense against external threats. It was also about understanding human nature, recognizing that people's emotional needs didn't disappear just because they were on a difficult and dangerous journey. The most successful leaders were those who could balance the practical requirements of the mission with the human needs of the people under their command. The journey through the Malacca Strait presented challenges, that went beyond the political complications in Palembang. The waters here were treacherous, filled with hidden reefs, unpredictable currents, and narrow passages that required expert piloting. The local pilots provided by the Sultan proved their worth, guiding the fleet through channels that seemed impossibly narrow for such large vessels. But these same pilots also represented a potential security risk. They knew exactly where the fleet was going and when it would be most vulnerable to attack. Marco Polo had to weigh the necessity of using local expertise against the possibility that this information might be sold to pirates or rival powers. He addressed this by ensuring that the pilots were well paid and by making it clear that they would be held personally responsible if the fleet encountered any unexpected difficulties. The crossing of the Bay of Bengal tested the fleet's seaworthiness in ways that even the experienced Chinese sailors found challenging. The monsoon winds that drove them westwards also generated waves that seemed mountainous to anyone accustomed to calmer waters. The ships pitched and rolled with a violence that made it nearly impossible to move around the decks, and seasickness affected almost everyone aboard. Marco Polo discovered that he was fortunate in having a naturally strong stomach for sea travel, but watching others suffer from constant nausea and vomiting was its own form of torture. The princess, after an initial period of severe seasickness, proved to be remarkably resilient. She recovered more quickly than many of the seasoned sailors, and even began to enjoy the dramatic seascape when the weather permitted time on deck. During calmer periods, Marco Polo and the princess would sometimes stand at the rail, watching the sun set over an ocean that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. These were surprisingly peaceful moments amid the constant stress and danger of the expedition. They would talk about their hopes for the future, their memories of the life they were leaving behind, and their anxieties about what awaited them in Persia. The princess confided that she was apprehensive about meeting Argon, her future husband. She had never seen him, knew him only through diplomatic descriptions that were probably more flattering than accurate, and understood that her feelings about the marriage were ultimately irrelevant to the political alliance it would create. Marco Polo, who had spent enough time in Mongol society to understand the expectations placed on royal women, could offer only limited comfort. But he could promise that he would do everything in his power to ensure that she arrived safely, and that the diplomatic transition would be as smooth as possible. The stop at Ceylon provided a welcome respite from the challenges of open ocean sailing. The island was a major trading center, and the local ruler was eager to maintain good relations with the Mongol Empire. The fleet was able to take on fresh water and food supplies, make necessary repairs to the ships, and allow the crew and passengers some time to recover from the ordeal of the ocean crossing. But Ceylon also presented Marco Polo with a moral dilemma that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The island was home to a thriving slave market, and several of the merchants traveling with the expedition wanted to purchase slaves to bring with them to Persia. Slavery was an accepted institution throughout the medieval world, including in Venice, China, and Persia. But Marco Polo had always been uncomfortable with the practice, and the sight of human beings being bought and sold like livestock filled him with a revulsion he couldn't entirely suppress. He couldn't forbid the merchants from engaging in legal commerce, but he made it clear that slaves would not be given priority for the limited space available on the ships, and that any slaves brought aboard would have to be treated humanely according to standards he would personally enforce. This stance created some resentment among the merchants, but Marco Polo had learned that sometimes a leader had to make unpopular decisions based on principles rather than convenience. The final leg of the journey, from Ceylon to the Persian Gulf, was in many ways the most challenging. The fleet followed the western coast of India northward, stopping at various ports to take on supplies and gather intelligence about political conditions further north. At each stop, Marco Polo had to navigate complex local politics, paying appropriate respects to local rulers, while also asserting the authority that came from his position as the Con's representative. The heat along the Indian coast was oppressive, even worse than what they had experienced in Southeast Asia. The humidity was so thick it felt like breathing water, and everyone aboard the ships suffered from heat rashes, fungal infections, and a general physical misery that seemed to have no relief. The monsoon rains provided some cooling, but they also brought their own problems, flooding the lower decks and creating conditions where disease could spread rapidly. It was during this leg of the journey that Marco Polo truly earned his reputation as a capable leader. When an outbreak of dysentery threatened to decimate the expedition, he organized strict sanitation procedures and personally supervised the care of the sick. When tensions between different groups threatened to explode into violence, he mediated disputes with a patience and wisdom that impressed even those who had initially doubted his capabilities. As the fleet finally approached Hormuz, Marco Polo allowed himself to feel a cautious satisfaction. They had survived storms, pirates, disease, and political intrigue. They had lost many good people along the way, but they had succeeded in their primary mission. Princess Kaqchen would reach Persia safely, and the diplomatic alliance that Kublai Khan had worked so hard to arrange would be preserved. But even the successful completion of their diplomatic mission couldn't erase the toll the journey had taken on everyone involved. Marco Polo had aged visibly during the voyage, his hair now streaked with grey and his face marked by the constant stress of command decisions. He had learned lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the true cost of adventure that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The irony was that this harrowing, dangerous, diplomatically crucial journey would be largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by his earlier travels and his famous book. But for Marco Polo himself, it was the return journey that truly tested his character and proved his capabilities as more than just an observer of foreign customs, but as a leader capable of guiding others through impossible circumstances. As he stood on the dock at Hormuz, watching Princess Kaqchen prepare for the final stage of her journey to meet her new husband, Marco Polo knew that he had changed. The young man who had marveled at Chinese inventions and Mongol ceremonies was gone, replaced by someone who understood the real price of bridging cultures and the profound responsibility that came with serving as a link between civilizations. His journey home to Venice would be the final test, but compared to what he had already survived, it seemed almost manageable. Almost. The mystery of the Tarim mummies' European faces in ancient China. It's a blistering afternoon in 1900, and Swedish explorer Sven Hedin stands at the edge of what appears to be an ancient cemetery in China's remote Tarim Basin. The dry sand has preserved something that shouldn't exist, something that will challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient migration patterns and cultural exchange. Scattered across the desert floor are mummies, naturally preserved by the arid conditions. But these aren't the remains of ancient Chinese people. These are tall, fair-haired Europeans with aquiline noses and deep-set eyes, buried in a land they supposedly never reached. How did people who looked distinctly Caucasian end up mummified in the heart of Asia 4,000 years ago? What were they doing so far from any known European civilization? And why has their discovery become one of the most politically sensitive archaeological findings in modern history? The Tarim Basin, located in what is now western China's Xinjiang province, is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. It's a vast depression surrounded by some of the world's highest mountain ranges. including the Himalayas to the south and the Tian Shan to the north. The center of this basin is dominated by the Taklamakan Desert, whose name supposedly means go in and you won't come out in the local Yugur language. But this harsh landscape holds secrets preserved by its very hostility to life. The combination of extreme dryness, alkaline soil, and temperature fluctuations has created perfect mummification conditions, naturally preserving organic materials that would have decayed millennia ago in more hospitable climates. What emerges from this desert sand reads like pages from a lost chapter of human history. The first systematic excavation of these mummies began in the 1990s, led by archaeologist Victor Murr from the University of Pennsylvania. What his teams discovered defied conventional wisdom about ancient population movements and the supposed isolation of early Chinese civilization. The oldest mummies, dating back to around 2000 BCE, displayed unmistakably European characteristics. They had blonde or reddish-brown hair, fair skin that had been preserved by the dry conditions, and facial structures that would look more at home in ancient Ireland than ancient China. But perhaps most remarkably, these weren't primitive nomads who had wandered into the desert and died. They were sophisticated people with advanced textile technology, complex burial practices, and evidence of a thriving culture that had adapted to one of the world's most challenging environments. Their clothing, preserved in stunning detail by the desert conditions, revealed a mastery of weaving techniques that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. Consider the famous beauty of Lulan, discovered in 1980 but not fully appreciated until later analysis. This woman, who died around 2000 BCE, was buried wearing a felt hat, a hide coat, and leather boots. Her hair was carefully braided with colored threads, and she was buried with a basket containing kernels of wheat, an early variety that suggests these people were not just passing through but had established agricultural settlements in the region. Her features are strikingly European, with high cheekbones, a narrow nose, and hair that analysis has shown was originally a light brown color. Computer reconstruction of her face reveals someone who would blend seamlessly into a crowd in modern-day Scandinavia or Ireland. Yet she lived and died in the heart of Asia, thousands of miles from any known European settlement. Even more puzzling is the Churkin man, a mummy dating to around 1000 BCE, standing 6 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair and a full beard. He was buried in remarkably sophisticated woolen clothing with intricate patterns and colors that remain vivid after 3,000 years. His burial included felt stockings, leather shoes, and a cap decorated with feathers. Analysis of his hair showed traces of nicotine and THC, suggesting that these ancient people had access to tobacco and cannabis, substances that were supposedly unknown in this region during that time period. The textiles found with these mummies are perhaps even more remarkable than the mummies themselves. They display a level of sophistication in dyeing, weaving, and pattern work that challenges assumptions about the technological capabilities of Bronze Age peoples. The colors remain vibrant after millennia, suggesting advanced knowledge of mordants and dye chemistry. The patterns include complex plaids and geometric designs that show clear connections to textile traditions found in Europe and Central Asia. But who were these people, and how did they come to be living in one of the most remote regions on Earth? The answer lies in understanding the prehistoric migration patterns of Indo-European peoples, a story that's still being pieced together from archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence. The current theory suggests that these mummies belonged to the Tocharian people, speakers of an Indo-European language related to ancient Celtic and Germanic tongues. Historical Chinese sources mention the Tocharians, describing them as tall, fair-haired people who controlled the trade routes through Central Asia. But until the discovery of the mummies, most scholars assumed these descriptions were exaggerated or misunderstood. The Tocharians weren't primitive nomads, but the builders and rulers of sophistication, city-states along what would later become the Silk Road. They controlled the crucial mountain passes and oasis towns that made transcontinental trade possible. Cities like Karasha, Kacha, and Turfine were Tocharian settlements, cosmopolitan centers where goods and ideas flowed between east and west centuries before Marco Polo's famous journey. Archaeological evidence suggests that these people arrived in the Taurine Basin as part of a larger migration of Indo-European peoples that began around 3000 BCE. They brought with them advanced bronze-working technology, domesticated horses and cattle, and agricultural techniques that allowed them to thrive in the desert environment. They dug extensive irrigation systems, some of which are still visible today, and developed a sophisticated understanding of desert ecology. Their burial practices reveal a complex spiritual belief system. Many mummies were buried with staffs topped with carved animal heads, suggesting shamanic traditions. Others were interred with mirrors, combs, and personal ornaments that indicate significant social stratification. Some burials included horses, indicating the importance of these animals in their culture and economy. But perhaps most intriguingly, the mummies show evidence of extensive cultural exchange with neighboring peoples. Some individuals display mixed ancestry with both European and Asian features. Their clothing incorporates design elements from multiple traditions, and their burial goods include objects that clearly originated in distant regions. The discovery of these mummies has created significant political controversy in modern China. The Xinjiang region where they were found is home to the Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking Muslim minority who have had a tense relationship with the Chinese government. Some Uyghur activists have claimed the mummies as ancestors, using their European appearance to argue for the region's historical independence from Chinese control. The Chinese government has responded by restricting access to the mummies and limiting international research collaborations. Some of the most significant finds are now stored in restricted facilities, available only to approved researchers. The official Chinese narrative emphasizes the mummies' integration into Chinese civilization rather than their distinct cultural identity. This political sensitivity has hampered scientific research, but advances in DNA analysis have provided new insights into the mummies' origins and relationships. Genetic studies have confirmed their European ancestry while also revealing complex patterns of intermixing with local Asian populations. The results suggest multiple waves of migration and settlement, creating a diverse population that evolved over centuries in this remote region. One of the most fascinating aspects of recent research has been the analysis of ancient proteins and plant materials found with the mummies. These studies have revealed details about their diet, health, and environment that wouldn't be visible from bones and artifacts alone. We now know that these ancient peoples suffered from many of the same health problems that affect modern populations, including arthritis, dental disease, and respiratory problems, likely caused by the dusty desert environment. The preservation of organic materials has also allowed researchers to study ancient parasites and diseases, providing insights into the health challenges faced by people living in this harsh environment thousands of years ago. Some mummies show evidence of tuberculosis, while others display signs of injuries that may have resulted from the dangers of desert travel and tribal warfare. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of sophisticated urban settlements associated with these mummies. These aren't the camps of nomadic peoples, but permanent towns with planned layouts, advanced water management systems, and specialized craft production areas. The residents were skilled metalworkers, potters, and textile producers who created goods for local use and long-distance trade. The mystery of the Tari mummies continues to evolve as new discoveries are made and analytical techniques improve. Each new find adds another piece to the puzzle of how these European peoples came to thrive in the heart of Asia, and how their presence influenced the development of transcontinental trade and cultural exchange. What emerges is a picture of the ancient world as far more connected and cosmopolitan than previously imagined. These weren't isolated populations living in cultural bubbles, but sophisticated peoples who maintained extensive networks of trade, communication, and cultural exchange across vast distances. The Silk Road, rather than being a medieval innovation, appears to have been the formalization of trade routes and cultural connections that had existed for millennia. The Tari mummies represent more than just a fascinating archaeological discovery. They're evidence of humanity's ancient impulse to explore, migrate, and adapt to new environments, even when those environments seem impossibly hostile. They remind us that the boundaries we draw on modern maps are artificial constructs that would have been meaningless to peoples who saw the world as a vast network of opportunities and connections. The textile discoveries deserve particular attention because they reveal not just technical sophistication, but complex trade relationships that existed thousands of years before historians thought such networks were possible. The woolen fabrics found with many mummies show evidence of dyes that could only have come from distant regions. The deep blues came from indigo, which had to be imported from South Asia. The brilliant reds were derived from madder root, suggesting trade connections with regions where this plant grew naturally. Some textiles even show traces of silk fibers, indicating that these people had access to Chinese silk production centuries before the traditional dating of the Silk Road's establishment. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the mummies were buried wearing what can only be described as tartan patterns, complex plaids that are virtually identical to those found in ancient Celtic textiles from Scotland and Ireland. The mathematical precision required to create these patterns suggests not just technical skill, but cultural traditions that were maintained across vast distances and long periods of time. These aren't simple copies or coincidental similarities. They represent the preservation of specific cultural knowledge that these people carried with them across continents. The Yingpan Man, discovered in 1995, provides perhaps the most dramatic example of the cultural complexity of these ancient people. Dating to around 300 CE, much later than many of the other mummies, he represents the culmination of centuries of cultural development in the region. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, with blonde hair and European features, he was buried in clothing that tells the story of transcontinental trade and cultural exchange. His outer robe was made of Chinese silk, decorated with images of centaurs and other mythological creatures that clearly derive from Greek and Roman artistic traditions. Beneath this, he wore a red woolen tunic with gold thread embroidery showing stylized trees and animals. His boots were made of felt and leather, decorated with gold foil in patterns that echo both Persian and Central Asian artistic styles. Most remarkably, his face was covered with a gold mask that shows clear influences from multiple artistic traditions. But the Yingpan Man's burial goods tell an even more complex story. He was interred with a bow made of horn and sinew, indicating that these people maintained their warrior traditions, even as they became sophisticated traders and craftspeople. His quiver contained arrows with bronze points that show metalworking techniques derived from both Chinese and Western traditions. He was buried with a bronze mirror that bears inscriptions in 3 different scripts, suggesting that literacy and multilingualism were common among the elite of this society. The preservation conditions in the Tarim Basin have also allowed researchers to study the mummies' hair and even their stomach contents, providing unprecedented insights into their daily lives and diets. Analysis of hair samples has revealed that these people regularly consumed dairy products, grain-based foods, and meat from both domesticated and wild animals. Some mummies show evidence of having eaten foods that could only have come from distant regions, suggesting either extensive trade networks or seasonal migration patterns that brought them into contact with diverse environments. The study of ancient DNA from these mummies has revealed genetic patterns that challenge simple narratives about population movements and cultural development. While the earliest mummies show predominantly European genetic markers, later individuals display increasingly complex ancestry that includes contributions from East Asian, Central Asian, and even South Asian populations. This suggests not conquest or replacement, but gradual integration and intermarriage over centuries. Some of the most recent genetic studies have identified specific population groups that contributed to the ancestry of the Tarim mummies. The European component appears to derive primarily from populations related to ancient Scandinavians and early farmers from the Black Sea region. The Asian components include genetic markers found in modern Tibetan and Mongolian populations, as well as signatures that suggest contact with peoples from as far away as Southeast Asia. The implications of these genetic findings extend far beyond the Tarim Basin itself. They suggest that the ancient world was characterized by far more population movement and cultural exchange than previously believed. The idea of isolated, homogeneous ancient cultures appears to be largely a modern fiction. Instead, we see evidence of cosmopolitan societies that maintained connections across vast distances and integrated influences from multiple cultural traditions. Recent excavations have also uncovered evidence of the agricultural and technological innovations that allowed these people to thrive in such a challenging environment. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled snowmelt from distant mountains to create fertile oases in the desert. Some of these systems, known as caravanserais, involved underground channels that could transport water for dozens of miles without significant evaporation loss. The agricultural remains found at Tocharian sites show that these people cultivated a diverse range of crops adapted to different microclimates within the desert environment. They grew wheat and barley in areas with reliable water access, but also developed techniques for cultivating drought-resistant crops like millet in more marginal areas. They maintained orchards of fruit trees, including apples, pears, and apricots, some of which may represent early varieties that were later spread to other regions through trade. Archaeological evidence suggests that these settlements were not simple farming communities but sophisticated. Urban centers with specialized craft production, administrative structures, and religious institutions. The ruins of cities like Nia and Caradong show evidence of planned layouts, defensive walls, and public buildings that required significant organizational capabilities to construct and maintain. The writing systems used by these people provide another window into their complex cultural identity. The Tocharian languages were written using a modified version of the Brahmi script, which originated in India but was adapted to represent sounds and grammatical structures that were fundamentally different from those of Indian languages. This suggests not just literacy, but sophisticated understanding of how writing systems could be modified and adapted to serve the needs of different linguistic communities. Some of the most fascinating discoveries have been the wooden documents that have survived in the dry desert conditions. These include contracts, letters, administrative records, and even literary texts that provide direct insights into the daily lives and concerns of these ancient people. The contracts reveal complex legal systems that governed everything from marriage arrangements to international trade agreements. The letters show that ordinary people maintained correspondence across vast distances, suggesting communication networks that were both reliable and regularly used. The religious beliefs of the Tocharian peoples appear to have been as cosmopolitan as their material culture. Archaeological evidence shows influences from Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and various local shamanic traditions. Some sites contain Buddhist monasteries with artwork that blends Indian, Chinese, and local artistic styles. Others show evidence of fire altars associated with Zoroastrian practices, while many burials include objects that suggest belief in shamanic practices and ancestor worship. The religious beliefs of the Tocharian peoples appear to have been as cosmopolitan as their material culture. Archaeological evidence shows influences from Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and various local shamanic traditions. Some sites contain Buddhist monasteries with artwork that blends Indian, Chinese, and local artistic styles. Others show evidence of fire altars associated with Zoroastrian practices, while many burials include objects that suggest belief in shamanic practices and ancestor worship. The musical traditions of these ancient peoples provide another fascinating window into their culture. Several tombs have yielded remarkably well-preserved musical instruments, including stringed instruments that appear to be ancestors of both European and Asian instruments. One particularly significant find was a complete set of panpipes made from bamboo, with each pipe carefully tuned to create specific notes. Analysis of these instruments suggests that the Tocharians used musical scales and harmonic systems that were more sophisticated than those found in many contemporary civilizations. The discovery of these musical instruments has led researchers to reconsider assumptions about the spread of musical knowledge across Eurasia. Previously, scholars had assumed that musical traditions developed independently in different regions and only slowly influenced each other through gradual cultural contact. But the Tarim findings suggest that sophisticated musical systems were being shared across vast distances much earlier than previously believed, perhaps traveling along the same routes that would later carry silk and spices. The children's toys and games found in Tocharian sites reveal touching details about family life in these ancient communities. Archaeologists have discovered small wooden horses, carved dolls, gaming pieces, and even what appears to be an ancient version of dice. These objects remind us that despite the harsh environment and the exotic nature of their culture, these were fundamentally ordinary people who loved their children, played games, and found ways to create joy and entertainment in difficult circumstances. Some of the most poignant discoveries have been the burials of infants and young children. These graves often contain elaborate grave goods, including miniature versions of adult clothing, toys, and food offerings. The care taken in these burials speaks to the deep emotional bonds between parents and children that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. One particularly moving find was the burial of a young child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, who was interred wearing a felt coat decorated with colorful patterns and holding a small wooden horse. The preservation was so perfect that researchers could see the fine stitching on the coat and the worn spots on the toy where small hands had gripped it during play. The evidence of childhood diseases and injuries in the skeletal remains also provides insights into the challenges of raising children in this harsh environment. Many children show signs of nutritional stress during certain periods, suggesting that food shortages were a recurring problem. Others display evidence of injuries that healed, indicating that the community had sufficient medical knowledge to treat childhood accidents, and that children who survived these injuries were cared for during their recovery. The role of women in Tocharian society appears to have been more complex and multifaceted than in many other ancient cultures. Some female burials contain weapons, suggesting that at least some women participated in hunting or warfare. Others include elaborate weaving equipment and textile production tools, indicating that women were the primary producers of the sophisticated fabrics that have made these sites famous. Still others contain writing implements and administrative tools, suggesting that literacy and bureaucratic responsibilities were not exclusively male domains. One particularly significant female burial, dating to around 500 CE, contained the remains of a woman who was buried with a staff of office, seal rings used for authenticating documents, and a collection of writing tablets. The position of honor given to this burial and the nature of the grave goods suggest that this woman held significant administrative or political authority during her lifetime. Her skeleton shows no evidence of the physical wear patterns associated with heavy labor, suggesting she came from an elite background, but her burial also lacks some of the luxury items found in other high-status graves, perhaps indicating that her authority was based more on ability and achievement than on inherited privilege. The evidence of trade connections extends far beyond the textiles and luxury goods that first attracted archaeological attention. Chemical analysis of ceramic vessels found at Tocharian sites has revealed that they contain substances from an astonishing range of distant sources. One vessel held traces of a resin that could only have come from trees growing in Southeast Asia, over 2,000 miles away. Another contained residues of a particular type of honey that appears to be from bees native to the Mediterranean region. These findings suggest that the trade networks connecting these desert communities to the wider world were even more extensive and sophisticated than the impressive textile evidence had indicated. The astronomical knowledge of the Tocharian peoples represents another area where recent research has yielded surprising insights. Several sites contain what appear to be astronomical observation platforms, carefully aligned structures that would have allowed precise tracking of celestial movements. Markings on some of these structures correspond to significant astronomical events like solstices and equinoxes, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. This astronomical knowledge would have been practically valuable for a trading culture that needed to navigate across vast desert expanses and coordinate their movements with seasonal weather patterns. But it also suggests a level of intellectual curiosity and scientific sophistication that goes beyond mere practical necessity. These people were not just surviving in a harsh environment, they were studying the cosmos, attempting to understand their place in a vast universe. The evidence of metallurgical technology at Tocharian sites has also revised. Scholarly understanding of technological development in Central Asia. Researchers have found evidence of surprisingly advanced bronze and ironworking techniques, including methods for creating steel that were previously thought to have been developed much later. Some artifacts show evidence of techniques like pattern welding, where different types of metal are forged together to create blades with superior strength and flexibility. Perhaps most intriguingly, some sites have yielded evidence of experimental metallurgy, crucibles containing unusual combinations of metals that suggest these ancient smiths were actively experimenting with new alloys and techniques. This experimental approach to technology challenges the common assumption that ancient peoples simply followed established traditions without innovation. Instead, we see evidence of curiosity, creativity, and a willingness to try new approaches to solve practical problems. The final years of Tocharian civilization remain somewhat mysterious, but evidence suggests a gradual decline rather than a sudden catastrophe. Climate change appears to have played a significant role, with increasing aridity making it harder to maintain the agricultural systems that supported the population. Political changes, including the expansion of Turkic peoples into Central Asia and the growing power of Tang dynasty China, gradually eroded the political and economic autonomy that had allowed Tocharian city-states to thrive. By around 800 CE, Tocharian culture had largely been absorbed into the emerging Turkic and Islamic civilizations of Central Asia. The language gradually disappeared, surviving only in a few remote communities before finally becoming extinct. The cities were abandoned or repopulated by new groups who brought different cultural traditions. For over 1,000 years, the Tocharians existed only as puzzling references in Chinese historical texts and vague legends told by later inhabitants of the region. But the desert preserved their secrets, waiting for modern archaeology to reveal the remarkable story of these European peoples who created a sophisticated civilization in the heart of Asia, who connected East and West millennia before Marco Polo, and who remind us that human history has always been a story of migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange across boundaries that we often imagine to be fixed and impenetrable. As research continues, despite political obstacles, these ancient Europeans of Central Asia continue to reveal their secrets, challenging our assumptions about the past and reminding us that human history is far more complex and interconnected than we once believed. Life in a Silk Road caravanserai. The sun is setting over the mud brick walls of the caravanserai at Merv, and you can hear the sound that has welcomed weary travelers for centuries. The gentle tinkling of camel bells mixed with voices speaking a dozen different languages. You are Rashid, a Persian merchant who has made this journey 7 times, and you know that tonight you'll sleep safely for the first time in weeks, surrounded by walls thick enough to stop arrows, and guarded by men whose livelihoods depend on protecting the treasures that flow along the Silk Road. But a caravanserai is far more than just a fortified inn. It's a microcosm of the medieval world, a place where East truly meets West in ways that would be impossible anywhere else. As you guide your camels through the massive wooden gates, you're entering what might be the most cosmopolitan environment in the 13th century world. A place where a Buddhist monk from Tibet might share a meal with a Jewish trader from Baghdad, where Chinese silk merchants haggle with Venetian spice dealers, and where the latest innovations in mathematics, medicine, and engineering are exchanged along with goods and gold. The caravanserai at Merv is one of the largest and most sophisticated along the entire Silk Road, capable of housing over 1,000 people and twice as many animals. The structure itself is a marvel of medieval engineering, built around a central courtyard that's large enough to hold several football fields. The walls rise 30 feet high and are topped with crenellations that give the whole complex the appearance of a fortress, which in many ways it is. The main gates are massive, constructed of iron-bound oak that could withstand a siege, and they're guarded around the clock by armed men, who know that the wealth passing through these walls makes the caravanserai a target for every bandit and raider within 100 miles. But the gates also represent something more profound. They're the boundary between the dangerous, lawless world of the desert and a space governed by international law and protected by agreements between distant rulers. As you enter the courtyard, the first thing that strikes you is the organized chaos of international commerce. The central area is divided into sections by invisible but well-understood boundaries. Chinese traders have claimed the area near the eastern wall, their goods spread on colorful carpets, silk rolls catching the last light of day like captured rainbows. Persian merchants dominate the southern section, their stalls filled with carpets, metalwork, and the aromatic spices that make fortunes for those brave enough to transport them across continents. Near the western wall, you spot a group of Venetian traders, their pale skin marking them as clearly as their accented Persian. They're examining a collection of Chinese porcelain with the careful attention of men who know that a single cup might be worth more than a working man earns in a year. Their presence here, thousands of miles from home, represents one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval trade: the willingness of merchants to risk everything for the promise of extraordinary profits. But it's not just the valuable goods that catch your attention, it's the people themselves. A Mongol official moves through the crowd, his silk robes and elaborate hat marking his status as a representative of the Khan's administration. He's here to collect taxes and ensure that the proper tariffs are paid, but also to gather intelligence about trade routes, political developments, and anything else that might be of interest to his distant masters. Near the center of the courtyard, a group of Nestorian Christian priests from Central Asia are deep in theological discussion with a Buddhist monk from India. Despite their different faiths, they're united by their shared experience of long-distance travel and their roles as carriers of not just religious ideas, but also practical knowledge about medicine, languages, and local customs that can mean the difference between life and death for other travelers. The accommodations within the caravanserai are stratified according to wealth and status, creating a temporary social hierarchy that reflects the broader patterns of medieval society. The most successful merchants, those dealing in the highest value goods, occupy private rooms on the second floor of the structure. These chambers are small but comfortable, with carpeted floors, oil lamps for light, and lockable chests for storing the most precious goods. As a moderately successful Persian merchant, you've secured a space in one of the communal halls on the ground floor. These long, rectangular rooms house 20 or 30 travelers each, with sleeping areas marked out by portable screens or hanging carpets. It's not luxurious, but it's warm, dry, and infinitely safer than camping in the open desert. Your most valuable goods, carefully wrapped bundles of saffron and small packets of rare gems, are locked in the caravanserai's treasury, a heavily guarded vault where merchants can store items too precious to keep with them in the sleeping quarters. The poorest travelers, those working as guards, guides, or laborers, sleep in the stables alongside the animals. But even this basic accommodation includes access to the caravanserai's kitchens, baths, and medical facilities. No one is turned away as long as they can pay the modest fees, and the management understands that today's poor guard might be tomorrow's successful merchant. The economic activity within the caravanserai operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, there's the buying and selling of goods, merchants taking advantage of their temporary proximity to traders from distant regions to acquire items that will be fantastically valuable in their home markets. A Chinese merchant might trade silk for Persian carpets, knowing that these carpets will sell for 10 times their cost when he returns to Beijing. A Venetian trader might exchange European glass and metalwork for spices and precious stones that will make him wealthy beyond imagination in the markets of Constantinople or Venice. But the caravanserai also serves as an information exchange that's arguably even more valuable than the goods being traded. Merchants share knowledge about political developments, weather patterns, bandit activity, and market conditions in distant cities. This information can determine which routes are safe, which goods are in demand, and where the greatest profits can be made. You spend your first evening listening to a Mongolian trader describe the latest developments in Karakorum, the Khan's capital. Political changes there could affect trade policies throughout Central Asia, and merchants who are among the first to learn about such developments can position themselves to take advantage of new opportunities or avoid potential disasters. The dining arrangements within the caravanserai reveal the complex cultural negotiations required when people from radically different backgrounds must coexist in close quarters. The main kitchen prepares meals that can accommodate the dietary restrictions of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists. No small feat given the religious laws governing what each group can and cannot eat. Islamic merchants require halal food, with no pork and meat slaughtered according to specific procedures. Jewish traders need kosher meals, with different but equally strict requirements about food preparation and ingredient combinations. Buddhist monks often follow vegetarian diets, while some Christian sects have their own fasting periods and dietary restrictions. The kitchen staff, drawn from multiple ethnic and religious backgrounds themselves, have developed a sophisticated understanding of how to prepare meals that can satisfy these diverse requirements without causing offense. The evening meal becomes a social event that breaks down some of the barriers between different cultural groups. Merchants who might be rivals in the trading areas find themselves sharing stories, comparing notes about market conditions, and sometimes forming partnerships that will last for years. Language barriers are overcome through a combination of interpreters, trade pigeons, and the universal language of commerce. Tonight, you find yourself seated next to a Chinese official who speaks excellent Persian and is fascinated by your knowledge of European markets. He's particularly interested in the demand for Chinese goods in the West, and you share information about pricing and preferences that could influence Chinese production decisions. In return, he provides insights into Chinese manufacturing techniques and quality standards that could help you select better merchandise on future trading expeditions. The entertainment within the caravanserai reflects the same cultural diversity as everything else. Professional storytellers move through the dining areas, adapting their performances to audiences that might include people from a dozen different linguistic backgrounds. They've developed a repertoire of stories that transcend cultural boundaries. Epic tales of heroes and adventures that can be understood and appreciated regardless of the listener's origin. Musicians perform songs that blend instruments and musical styles from across the known world. A Persian santar might accompany a Chinese pipa and an Indian tabla in combinations that create entirely new musical experiences. These aren't just entertainment, they're cultural fusion happening in real time, creating artistic innovations that will spread along the trade routes and influence musical development across continents. The caravanserai also serves important medical and social functions that extend far beyond simple commercial activity. The establishment maintains a medical facility staffed by practitioners trained in different medical traditions. Chinese physicians skilled in acupuncture and herbal medicine work alongside Islamic doctors who understand surgical techniques in Persian. Practitioners who specialize in treating the injuries and illnesses common to long-distance travelers. This medical cooperation represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Silk Road culture. Despite political rivalries and religious differences, medical knowledge flows freely between practitioners, creating a kind of international medical system that serves travelers regardless of their origin or destination. Techniques developed in one tradition are tested and refined by practitioners from others, leading to medical innovations that benefit everyone. The caravanserai's role as a social center extends to serving as a place where marriages are arranged, business partnerships formed, and political alliances negotiated. Wealthy merchants use their stays here to introduce their sons to potential business partners or marriage prospects from other merchant families. The temporary community created within these walls often produces relationships that will span continents and last for generations. Religious activities within the caravanserai are carefully managed to accommodate the diverse spiritual needs of the travelers while avoiding conflicts that could disrupt the peaceful coexistence essential to successful trade. Muslims have access to prayer facilities oriented toward Mecca, while Christians can attend services conducted by traveling priests. Buddhists find spaces for meditation and followers of other faiths are provided with areas for their own worship practices. But perhaps most remarkably, the caravanserai frequently hosts interfaith discussions where religious scholars from different traditions engage in theological debates and exchanges of ideas. These conversations, conducted in an atmosphere of mutual respect and intellectual curiosity, represent a level of religious tolerance that would be remarkable in any era, but was particularly extraordinary in the medieval world. The banking and financial services available within the caravanserai demonstrate the sophisticated economic systems that had developed to support long-distance trade. Money changers can convert between dozens of different currencies. Their knowledge of exchange rates and the relative purity of various gold and silver coins making them essential intermediaries in international commerce. More sophisticated financial instruments are also available. Letters of credit allow merchants to transfer wealth across vast distances without the risk of carrying large amounts of gold or silver. Insurance arrangements protect against the loss of goods to bandits, weather, or other disasters. Partnership agreements allow merchants to pool resources for large-scale trading ventures that no individual could afford. These financial innovations, developed to serve the needs of Silk Road traders, represent some of the earliest examples of international banking and commercial law. The systems created here would eventually influence the development of commercial practices that are still recognizable in modern international trade. As the evening progresses and the last light fades from the sky, the caravanserai settles into its nighttime routine. Guards take their positions on the walls. Their presence a constant reminder that the wealth and safety within these walls must be protected against external threats. But inside, the atmosphere is one of security and cosmopolitan sophistication that would be remarkable in any era. You make your final rounds, checking on your animals and securing your remaining goods before retiring to your sleeping area. Tomorrow, you'll continue your journey, but tonight you rest in comfort, surrounded by the sounds and smells of one of the most remarkable institutions in human history, a place where the dreams of merchants and the reality of international commerce created temporary communities that bridged cultures and connected civilizations. As you drift off to sleep, listening to the multilingual murmur of conversation and the distant sound of music, you're participating in something far greater than simple trade. You're part of a human network that spans continents, a system of relationships and exchanges that is creating the first truly global economy and laying the foundation for the interconnected world that will eventually emerge from these humble but extraordinary desert crossroads. The caravanserai represents humanity at its most adaptable and cooperative. Proof that even in an age of political fragmentation and religious conflict, the basic human drive to explore, trade, and connect with others could create spaces of peace, prosperity, and cultural exchange that transcended the boundaries that divided the medieval world. The morning routine of the caravanserai begins before dawn, when the first calls to prayer echo across the courtyard and the earliest risers begin preparing for another day's journey. The kitchen staff has already been awake for hours, preparing the morning meals that will fuel hundreds of travelers for the day ahead. The bakers work massive tandoor ovens, producing thousands of flatbreads that will be consumed with tea, dried fruit, and whatever other provisions travelers have brought with them. You wake to the familiar sounds of a caravan preparing to depart, the complaints of camels being loaded, the multilingual chatter of merchants checking their goods, and the metallic sounds of guards checking their weapons and equipment. Some caravans will leave this morning, heading east or west along the ancient trade routes, while others, like yours, will remain for another day or two, allowing time for rest, repairs, and the complex negotiations that are as much a part of Silk Road commerce as the physical transportation of goods. The bathing facilities at the caravanserais represent a remarkable achievement of medieval engineering and a crucial amenity for travelers who have spent weeks or months in desert conditions. The hammam, or bathhouse, uses a sophisticated system of channels and heating chambers to provide hot water for bathing. The water comes from underground springs that have been carefully channeled into cisterns, then heated using furnaces that burn dried camel dung, one of the few consistently available fuels in the desert environment. The social rituals surrounding the bathhouse are as carefully choreographed as any diplomatic ceremony. Different times are designated for different groups, ensuring that religious requirements for modesty and purity can be met. Muslim travelers have designated times for ritual washing before prayers. Other groups have their own schedules, but beyond the practical hygiene benefits, the bathhouse serves as a crucial social space where travelers can relax, exchange information, and form the relationships that often prove as valuable as any material goods traded along the Silk Road. You spend the morning in the bathhouse, luxuriating in the simple pleasure of hot water and the opportunity to truly clean yourself for the first time in weeks. The attendants, skilled professionals who have seen travelers from every corner of the known world, work methodically to scrub away layers of accumulated desert grime. They're also informal sources of information, sharing news about conditions on various routes, political developments in distant regions, and rumors about bandit activity or unusually profitable trading opportunities. The marketplace within the caravanserai operates according to complex but well-understood rules that have evolved over centuries of international trade. Each type of good has its designated area, and merchants are expected to display their wares in ways that allow potential buyers to examine quality without necessarily committing to a purchase. The etiquette of negotiation is elaborate, involving ritual offers of tea, extended discussions about weather and travel conditions, and only gradually approaching the actual business of setting prices. You spend much of the morning in the spice merchants section, examining the goods of traders who have brought their wares from India, Southeast Asia, and even the mysterious spice islands that most merchants know only through the accounts of others. The air here is almost overwhelming, thick with the scents of cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, pepper, and dozens of other aromatic substances. Each merchant has small samples available for tasting, and part of the morning's entertainment involves sampling these offerings while engaging in the verbal sparring that precedes any serious negotiation. The Persian carpet dealers occupy a particularly prestigious section of the marketplace, their goods representing some of the most valuable items traded along the Silk Road. These are not the mass-produced items of later eras, but genuine masterpieces, hand-noted textiles that might represent months or even years of skilled labor. The merchants can provide detailed provenance for each piece, describing the village where it was made, the craftsperson who created it, and the symbolic meanings of various patterns and color combinations. One merchant shows you a carpet that depicts a garden scene with remarkable intricacy, each flower and bird rendered with a precision that seems almost photographic. He explains that this particular pattern represents the Islamic concept of paradise, and that owning such a carpet is believed to bring blessings to the household. The price he quotes is astronomical, more than you could earn from 3 successful trading expeditions. But you appreciate the opportunity to examine such a masterpiece, even though you have no intention of purchasing it. The caravanserai's administrative functions are centered in a series of offices that occupy the 2nd floor of the main building. Here, scribes maintain records of all goods passing through the facility, calculating the tariffs and taxes owed to various authorities. These scribes are typically multilingual and numerate, able to work with different currency systems, weights and measures, and legal frameworks. They're essential intermediaries who help translate between the different commercial and legal traditions that meet along the Silk Road. You spend some time in these offices, ensuring that your goods have been properly registered, and that you have the necessary documentation for the next stage of your journey. The chief administrator, an elderly Persian man who has worked at this caravanserai for over 30 years, takes time to discuss conditions on the routes ahead. He's seen thousands of caravans pass through these gates and has developed an almost supernatural ability to predict which routes will be safe and profitable and which should be avoided. His advice is typically oblique, offered in the form of observations and suggestions rather than direct recommendations. He mentions that several caravans heading east have reported unusual military activity near certain mountain passes. He notes that the governor of a city along your planned route has recently been replaced, and that the new official's attitudes toward foreign merchants are not yet clear. He observes that weather patterns this year seem to be following unusual cycles. Each comment is a piece of a puzzle that experienced merchants must assemble to make informed decisions about their routes and timing. The veterinary facilities at the caravanserai are as important as any of the amenities provided for human travelers. The animals, primarily camels, but also horses, donkeys, and occasionally oxen, represent enormous investments and are absolutely essential for the success of any trading expedition. The caravanserai employs several full-time animal doctors who have learnt their craft through apprenticeship with older masters and through direct experience treating the ailments and injuries that commonly affect working animals in desert conditions. You bring your camels to the veterinary area for examination, even though none are showing obvious signs of illness or injury. The head veterinarian, a grizzled Mongol who has spent his entire life working with animals, examines each camel with practiced efficiency. He checks their feet for stones or injuries, examines their teeth to assess their overall health, and runs his hands along their bodies feeling for swelling, heat, or other signs of developing problems. For one of your camels, he recommends a special poultice for a developing saddle sore that you hadn't even noticed. For another, he suggests adjusting the loading technique to reduce stress on a joint that shows early signs of inflammation. His expertise could easily mean the difference between completing your journey successfully and losing valuable animals to preventable conditions. The fees he charges are modest, but you tip him generously, knowing that cultivating a good relationship with such experts is an investment that will pay dividends on future journeys. The evening at the caravanserai brings a different kind of energy than the busy daytime hours. As the sun sets and the temperature drops to more comfortable levels, the courtyard transforms into a vast outdoor gathering space. Merchants who are rivals during the day become companionable dinner companions. Guards who maintained vigilant watch during daylight hours relax around fires, sharing stories and sometimes engaging in friendly competitions of skill. The storytellers and entertainers who make their living at the caravanserai emerge for their evening performances. These are not amateurs, but professionals who have refined their crafts over years of performing for international audiences. They've learned which stories resonate across cultural boundaries, which jokes translate well, and how to read an audience and adjust their performances accordingly. Tonight's featured storyteller is a woman from Samarkand, rare in a profession dominated by men but famous throughout Central Asia for her performances. She tells the tale of a merchant who sought to trade with the jinn, supernatural beings said to inhabit remote deserts and mountains. Her performance is mesmerizing, incorporating elements of poetry, song, and dramatic gesture. Even though you've heard similar stories before, her telling makes the ancient tale fresh and compelling. The musicians who accompany her create soundscapes that blend traditions from across the known world. A Chinese piper provides delicate, melodic lines that weave around the deeper tones of a Persian tar. Drums from India provide rhythmic complexity that gives the music a propulsive energy. The result is something entirely new. A musical fusion that could only exist in spaces like this, where different traditions meet and interact. As the evening deepens and you prepare for sleep, you reflect on the remarkable institution that the caravanserai represents. It's more than just a resting place for travelers. It's a mechanism for maintaining the complex networks of trust, information, and relationships that make long-distance trade possible. It's a space where cultural differences are not just tolerated but celebrated, where diversity is recognized as a source of strength rather than a threat. The caravanserai embodies the best possibilities of human civilization, the recognition that we are stronger together than apart, that exchange and interaction enrich all participants, and that the differences between peoples and cultures can be sources of fascination and mutual benefit rather than conflict and suspicion. And so we reach the end of our journey along the Silk Road, from the brutal realities of camel driving to the diplomatic adventures of Marco Polo, from the mysteries of ancient mummies to the cosmopolitan world of the caravanserai. These stories remind us that the past was far more connected and complex than we often imagine, filled with ordinary people doing extraordinary things, creating the networks of trade and culture that would eventually shape our modern world. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of boring history for sleep. I hope these stories have given you something interesting to think about as you drift off, and perhaps even appear in your dreams tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing for more historical explorations. And let me know in the comments what corners of the past you'd like to visit next. Sleep well and dream of caravans crossing moonlit deserts, of ancient mysteries waiting to be solved, and of the remarkable people who connected our world long before we thought such connections were possible. Until next time, good night.